The 2025 NCAA Indoor Championships will be going down in Virginia Beach at the Virginia Beach Sports Center. It's a relatively new facility which only opened, less than 5 years ago in 2020, and since then, it has hosted everything from high school to NCAA meets. But this will be the first time NCAA Indoors will be held in Virginia, and even more importantly, just the second time in decades that NCAAs is being held on the East Coast, only after the meet was held just last year in Boston in 2024. Now, for a long time, athletes and coaches, they've been accustomed to attending NCAA Indoors at either the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, Texas A&M in College Station, or even other, cities such as Albuquerque, New Mexico, Birmingham, Alabama, or even Nampa, Idaho back in 2012. But if you notice, all these sites are either in the south of the US or out west. Now, you would think that considering how many indoor tracks have existed on the East Coast, for decades, there would be at least one NCAA Indoor Championships hosted there previously. Either New York City, in Boston, Virginia Tech, Clemson, all these cities have, capable indoor tracks. And again, NCAAs in 2012 was held in Nampa, Idaho. All due respect, but it's kind of crazy to think that Idaho held an NCAAs before anything on the East Coast. Well, actually, if we look back through history, there was an NCAA Indoors held out east, and it went down way before many of us, I know myself, way before I was even born. So let's take a trip back through the history of NCAA Indoors to understand how we got to this point. The NCAA as an entity has been around since the 1920s, with the first outdoor meet being held in Chicago in 1921. But it wasn't until 1965 that the first NCAA Indoor Championships was held. It actually was held in Detroit, Michigan, and hosted by the University of Michigan, which was down the road in Ann Arbor. While in Detroit, the Cobo Center, which is now known as Huntington Place, it would construct a temporary track every single winter for the NCAA Indoor Championships. This occurred for almost 2 full decades until 1982, when the NCAA Indoor Championships would leave Detroit for the first time, now moving up the road to the Pontiac Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan for the 1982 and 1983 Indoor Championships. Now, one interesting thing is that the Cobo Arena actually began a massive renovation and expansion in 1981, which was eventually completed in 1989. So I think this might have been the reason that the Indoor Championships left the venue in Detroit, but still remained in Michigan, just moving up to Pontiac. Additionally, women only started competing as part of the NCAA Championships in 1982 outdoors, and then indoors in 1983 when the first combined men's and women's indoor championships was held. But after 2 years in Pontiac and 19 years in Michigan as a whole, 1984 saw the NCAA Indoor Championships finally move outside of Michigan, this time to Syracuse, New York. Held in the Carrier Dome on the campus of Syracuse University, the 1984 and 1985 NCAA Indoor Championships would be the first time we would see the event on the East Coast. Names like Mike Connolly and Merlene Ottey to Roger Kingdom and Carol Lewis, some of the most legendary athletes we now know in the sport today, they graced the track in Syracuse while they were still collegiate athletes in the mid-1980s. Unfortunately, the meet in Syracuse would be very short-lived, as after just 2 years, the NCAA Indoor Champs would be moved down south for the first time, now to the Cox Convention Center in Oklahoma City, which would play host from 1986 all the way to 1988. So, in just a span of 5 years, from 1981 all the way to 1986, NCAA Indoors had moved between 4 different cities: Detroit, Pontiac, Syracuse, and now Oklahoma City. But this movement wouldn't last long, as in 1989, the championships moved back up to the Midwest, now being hosted at the RCA Dome in Indianapolis, Indiana. And this is where the championships would remain for a full decade, all the way to 1999. So NCAA athletes got very accustomed going to Indiana every single year. Now, up to this point, the various locations where NCAA Indoor Champs were held kind of had temporary tracks, meaning that these venues were either convention centers or other sports complexes that hosted other events throughout the entire year, such as concerts or basketball and football games or large conferences, auto shows, right? All these other kind of events would be hosted in these venues. In the weeks leading up to the NCAA Indoors, the space would be converted and the track would be built up piece by piece. The meet would go down and then the track would quickly be taken down after that. If you remember, the 2016 World Indoor Championships, they went down in Portland, Oregon, and that was a temporary track that, of course, no longer exists to this day. It was built up, it was put in place for USA Indoors, World Indoor Championships, and then taken down after that. But 2000 kind of introduced a shift where the University of Arkansas opened the Randall Tyson Track Center, which was a permanent track and field facility in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So at that point, the NCAA Indoor Championships were moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and would remain there for almost a full decade through the year 2008. Now, to be clear, there were other permanent indoor tracks that definitely existed across the country. You're talking about the Armory in New York City, the Boston University Track and Field and Tennis Center, Harvard's Gordon Indoor Track, Clemson, they had their indoor track complex, even Virginia Tech, they had their Charles Rector facility. There were a ton of other permanent indoor tracks. And if you notice, all the venues that I just named on that list, they're all on the East Coast and all permanent indoor tracks constructed between the early 90s to the mid 2000s. So they were more than capable of hosting the NCAA Indoor Championship meet. Yes, venues kind of something like the Armory might be a little constricting in different capacities, but they were all permanent indoor tracks. But as I noted, the event remained at Arkansas for almost a decade and produced some of the best marks in history as the facility was made specifically for track and field, including that relatively high bank that produced some very fast times. We're talking about world records, NCAA records, some of the best performances in history around the world. But as the years went on, we then started to see a bit more diversity come into play. 2009, Texas A&M opened its new indoor facility and played host to the NCAA championships that year, which eventually started to alternate between Arkansas and Texas A&M between 2009, 2010, 2011. Then, in 2012, the meet moved all the way out west to Nampa, Idaho, where Boise State hosted the meet at the Jackson Center, a track that unfortunately no longer exists as it was sold back in, I think, about 2021. Now, fast forward over the next decade, and the meet would be brought to Albuquerque, New Mexico, Birmingham, Alabama, as well as back to Arkansas and Texas A&M, all between 2013 and 2023. Well, as we circle back to 2024, 40 years after it was hosted at Syracuse University, the NCAA Indoor Championships finally returned to the East Coast, this time to the track at New Balance in Boston, Massachusetts. Which now brings us to 2025, where the consistent cycle of rotating locations, continues with the meet being held in Virginia Beach this year. Now, as I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, some venues may not be as favorable to athletes and schools due to things like travel, warm-up facilities, logistics, and various other factors. But I do think there is a positive to having the meet move around to various different cities around the country. It gives athletes the opportunity to experience something completely brand new during the few years that they have as an NCAA athlete. Something we unfortunately can't say about the outdoor meet. Shout out to Eugene, Oregon. But overall, we can kind of see the progression that the NCAA Indoor Championships has had in terms of the different locations that it's been in, whether it's starting back in 1965 out in Detroit, Michigan, spending almost 20 years before moving to New York, moving down to Oklahoma City, spending a decade out in Indianapolis, Indiana, moving down to a permanent track in the University of Arkansas, spending decades down south and out west, to finally moving back out east, this time to Boston, and now finally in 2025 being held in Virginia. But let me know what you think about the NCAA Championships having moved around the country at various different points. Do you think it's a good idea for the meet to be moving around to different cities and different universities, or do you think it would be more beneficial to have one central location, probably at the best indoor track like a University of Arkansas or a Texas A&M or wherever it may be, similar to the outdoor meet always being hosted in Eugene, Oregon? Be sure to like the video if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, always appreciate y'all, and thanks for watching.